Welcome to the Road to Accountable AI. I'm Kevin Werbach, professor of legal studies and business ethics at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. For decades, I've studied emerging technologies from broadband to blockchain. Today, artificial intelligence promises to transform our world. But AI won't reach its potential without accountability, mechanisms to ensure it's deployed in responsible, safe, and trustworthy ways. On this podcast, I speak with the experts leading the charge for accountable AI. What will it take to make AI governance effective in the private sector? That's the question my guest Lauren Wagner is focused on. She currently advises organizations including the RAND Corporation, Arc Prize Foundation, and early stage startups, as well as being a scout for the VC firm Andreessen Horowitz and a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Our conversation drills down into how to align incentives for AI developers and deployers to effectively address governance concerns, the relationship between private activity and government actions, the challenges companies face in implementing AI governance on the ground, and what positives we can take from contentious debates over AI regulation. Lauren, welcome. Great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Tell us a little bit about your journey. You've done a number of different things in your career. How did you make your way into AI governance?
Sure. So I'm a computational social scientist by training. Back in 2010, I was looking at online social networks. So at the time, mostly Facebook and Twitter, and figuring out if we could learn anything from the network structure about how it influenced individuals. So since then, 2010 and before that, I've always been thinking about how can you use technology for good and to make people feel more supportive, more productive, things like that. So after this research, I ended up moving into the private sector, so digital health, Google, working on the Google Assistant in the early days, and then Meta, building products to combat misinformation, also some projects on privacy protected data sharing. So the through line between all of those was there was a governance element to all of these different projects, starting with what I was doing in the academy. And then that really put a finer point on it when I was working at Meta, combating misinformation, online harms, everything was related. There was an intersection between what we were building on the tech side, policy side, how this impacted users. So some of it really was a play, and I don't love this word, but self-governance. And how do we do the right thing, or how do we take steps to build trust with users outside of regulation and the law explicitly mandating it? So after leaving Meta, I saw the power of these levers. I mean, I was in this big company, and I thought, is there any way to do this kind of work where you're compelling companies to build more trustworthy systems outside of regulation and outside of the big platforms? So over the past 2 or so years, I've been working on various AI governance projects along these same lines with startups, VCs, Fortune 100, and also some direct policy advocacy as well.
What was your experience like at Meta and Google in terms of the commitment to addressing these risks and harms of AI, and how much of a challenge it was to actually make progress inside those organizations?
Yeah, so at Google, I was very early on the Google Assistant. So this was 2017. You had the Assistant versus Alexa wars, and this was pre-Transformer. So we weren't really thinking about these existential risks in the confines of the product, because they didn't really exist. I was helping to build the developer ecosystem. So we had some guardrails there, but it was a 0 to 1 product. So we were just trying to get to the first phase. But obviously I was thinking a bit more about human computer interaction and what this would look like moving forward for users, as I think I called it like ambient AI. So as AI was kind of infused in everything and every interaction and every experience, what would be the knock-on effects there? So it was kind of a fun thought experiment at the time in terms of the practicality of the products that we were working with. At Meta, it was a bit different. AI was already infused in all of the products I was working on, whether it was news and ranking, and then combating online harm. So these fact-checking products, we used AI in all of those. And so we were that kind of governance element was part of the day-to-day work. What are the guardrails? Um, what are the guardrails for these products? How are we developing them? How are we putting them in production? And then monitoring what happened when things went live. So we worked with a lot of different external organizations, whether it's civil society, academia, policymakers, think tanks, etc., to help us with all of these different activities.
And then, you mentioned some of the things that you've done subsequently, but part of your work has been working with investors and VCs. So what is their perspective or perception, do you think, around guardrails and AI governance type issues?
Well, it obviously is investor
Hmm.
specific. The first project I worked with Responsible Innovation
Hmm.
Labs, which is a nonprofit that was started by the founder of General Catalyst. And so it's funny that these days responsible has a lot of there. It's a weighted term. If we replace responsible with trustworthy, whatever it is, um, having worked on AI in regulated or self-regulated industries, I saw the importance of thinking about governance very early on, and how it, developers, engineers, founders, they're making decisions every single day about what the product is and what it isn't. And so you could say it's just product design and development and
Hmm.
like day-to-day engineering, but if you really look at it, it's essentially you're making governance decisions about the product. And so the idea there was, can we take some of the resources that have been put forward? I mean, this was back in 2023, which now seems like a decade ago, even though it wasn't. Um, and so, if you're building in a regulated space or a space where you really have to build trust with customers, users, it's AI, maybe it's higher risk, whatever it um, is there any way that we can help guide these companies to be more thoughtful, maybe have some more structured thinking around it, have some more documentation? And so I think that yields more sustainable, durable, successful companies for specific kinds of companies. And I've seen that firsthand. And then when also speaking with later stage investors, what some of them are concerned about is there are a lot of unknowns with AI right now. And so a growth stage investor, an investor that would take a company public later on, they want to make sure that governance process are in place early so that you don't have to retrofit as like they come on board and they're looking at the company and looking to invest and looking to grow it, and help accelerate. They're like, we want to make sure that you're kind of set up to succeed, so we're not having to change all of these things from a governance perspective as we move in. And because AI at this point is really a paradigm shift, there is a need to pull more resources and people and kind of like thought behind solving that problem.
So the main reason I was interested in speaking with you is you've been promoting the idea of market-driven or private AI governance. And it's somewhat implicit in some of the things you've already talked about, but can you just describe what does that mean to you? What is that concept?
Sure. So for me, what market driven AI governance is, outside of laws being passed or a government or some standards body saying you have to
Mm.
do this or you have to do that, is there any way to align incentives in the private sector to compel companies to build more trustworthy AI systems? And so I did this, as I mentioned, from various different perspectives. It was kind of a hypothesis that I had because I saw it within the big companies. I saw it with some of the early stage startups that I invested in, and what led to the companies that really were successful and kind of the decisions they made early on. So I ended up working with, as I mentioned, investors, so venture capitalists, startups themselves, and then Fortune 100 companies. And so they, as the customers of these products, are saying, how do we evaluate what's coming through the door, whether it's a big company or a startup? And so I thought, okay, if I can play in that space, that's a really big lever. So if we develop criteria that make sense for both the enterprise and the startups, you can really have kind of an ecosystem wide push to move companies in, I don't want to say a different direction, but some where governance is considered earlier on.
Where are the incentive mismatches? Presumably, you're talking about something more than just for-profit companies don't want to be held back in deploying new products by regulation or by limits.
Yeah, I don't I think that's a very nice it's a neat narrative of saying, oh, they're moving too fast. They don't want to do this. But the fact of the matter is these teams are so small. I've worked at early stage startups. I work with startups now. They don't necessarily think about it. It's like you don't know what you don't know. And so what I was trying to do here is really understand what the pain points
Mm,
were for these enterprise customers. And so it turns out that when they're evaluating third-party AI systems, a lot of the kind of the checklist that they have is very risk oriented. And so it does come out of this compliance space, even though there are laws on the books for AI, but they're really adapting from other checklists they have. And it doesn't help them understand, is this going to generate
mm,
value? And is this going to present risk to our organization that we maybe didn't anticipate or could mitigate if only we knew and can kind of put the pieces together and also bake this into a contract. So the liability, I know you want to talk about that, but that's a big question. So these companies are looking at startups, they're looking at big AI companies, there are a lot of unknowns, and they're saying, okay, if this goes wrong, who like what company is less risky for us to work with? And it ends up being a big company. So they think, all right, if it's not baked out of like who's at fault for this, at least we can sue someone, or at least like there's a company with a big pile of money and we can kind of figure it out or sort it out. And so I think like one of my personal ethos is that to mitigate the risks of technology, we need more people with eyes on the problem who can build and potentially build new technological solutions. So when I see startups that are potentially stuck, have a great technology, but potentially they're stuck in procurement and they can't get those design partnerships, and they're wondering why an enterprise isn't moving forward. And I know it could be just because of this like liability
mm.
issue, or they don't quite trust it and they don't know how to evaluate it, but they don't want to say these things and they're just going to default to going with a bigger company. I see that present negative effects for the wider ecosystem outside of, oh, I invest in early stage startups, I want them to be huge and I want them to be successful. So there are a lot of different equities at play, and I see this as benefiting the whole ecosystem and users.
What exactly is missing that the big companies need to get that kind of comfort level?
Um, I mean, at a very high level, as I mentioned, the checklists today are very risk oriented. There's very little that really touches on value and also risk mitigation. And so some of this is going to sound very simplistic, and it is an oversimplification because I've spoken to, dozens of companies. But at a high level, like, let's get back to basics. How is your product built? What's the tech stack? Where is AI actually used and where is it not used? So a lot of companies, startups especially, they're selling. It's AI,
Mhm.
it's shiny, we're doing this. But that black box element to it, which people would say, oh, it's the secret sauce, that could actually hurt a company. And so when I talk to early stage startups, I say, walk them through like the end-to-end user journey and show them exactly where AI is being used. Because all that an enterprise at times, like when an enterprise sees is like, oh no, I don't understand this. Like this seems
Mm.
risky. Maybe we should build something ourselves, which like are they capable of that? Who knows? It depends on the company. And so something as simplistic as like, what does the tech stack look like? What is the user journey? Where is AI? Where does AI not used? Understanding what we would call fourth party integrations. So what models are you building on top
Mhm.
of? Are you fine tuning? Things like that. Copyright certainly comes into play, and data ownership. So it's not even, are you legally allowed to train on certain types of information? Are we going to get in trouble as a company if we use this and it turns out it's not yours? But when our employees or whomever use the product, who owns that data? Or is it going back into the product? Do you own the data? And so working out these major questions and then coming to an agreement that's codified in a contract and there's actually accountability there is kind of where I'd like to see the ecosystem move, in addition to more proactive transparency from the lab and AI
Mhm.
company side, which I'm happy to talk more
Yeah,
about.
why don't you? Where does transparency come into play, and what exactly do you mean by transparency in this context?
Yeah, so I think there is a lot to learn some people might say, oh, from the last era of social media, it's not even the last era. Like now things are running in parallel and AI is part of these companies. But I think you can learn a lot. And I worked on Facebook open research and transparency. So we did a lot of work on transparency, whether it was reporting or sharing privacy protected data with academics and policymakers so they can understand what was happening with the platform. And so looking at the transparency measures that have been adopted as standard practice among the AI labs, you have papers that have been published, which great. The more people understand the technology, the better. So I think that's been working pretty well. I'd like to see more things around peer review when you're publishing outside of the academy, but it seems that that's coming. And then model cards have become standard. And so those were developed years and years ago. The team that did it, it was an uphill battle, and it's amazing to see how it's really diffused throughout the ecosystem. But the genesis of model cards was for technical audiences. I mean, at the time, you didn't have people in the White House or, business people within these big companies really having serious conversations about AI. And so the information in model cards is being used to make business decisions and policy decisions. So is it time for us to have maybe a complement to a model card, whether it's an AI vendor card that has other types of information that can support that decision making? And so what I see there is it's kind of like, I don't want to say a consulting project, but it's a project of like understand the needs. What information do people need? What information would an AI lab or a startup feel comfortable sharing, but it's also in their benefit to share and be proactively transparent around it. And from speaking with a lot of different kinds of companies, it just seems that people don't quite know what to share, and they don't want to set themselves back. They don't want to, be transparent and have them end up being like behind if they're, in competition to win a deal or something, and they're more transparent. But if we have a project where we can align from the enterprise side or the policy side, like this is actually what we need and it's in your benefit to share it, and then kind of have it be an extension of model cards. So it's both a process of understanding needs, aligning incentives, but then also what's a seamless go to market here? And to me, that's an extension of a model card. You've built a muscle to have this kind of transparency, like let's just extend it. So it's not a net new lift for companies.
Does it make sense to standardize those kinds of elements across organizations? Obviously, there's a collective action problem if each company needs to come up with its own set of requirements, and each startup is responding to that. So there's benefit of having a lot of commonality. On the other hand, then it's a heavier lift to get everyone on board, and there are differences among companies.
Yeah, I think companies should be able to share what they want or what they don't want. If there are incentives to share certain kinds of information, great. Hopefully more companies orient around that. But we see it in the last, I want to call it era. These timelines are so short that can we call it an era? But if we looked at companies working in trust and safety when they were making rules around content policies, and it was about specific pieces of content and things like this. I also did research when I left Meta, where I spoke to dozens of people across different companies. And what ended up happening was Facebook ended up being the gold standard because they had put a lot of resources behind both doing this work and also making this work public and communicating it effectively. And so when a startup who had trust and safety considerations or had to manage online harms, they would go, that person would go online and say, oh, like what's this company doing? What's this company doing? Meta seems to have really robust policies. We're just going to take what Meta is doing and we're going to adopt that into our own work. So I've seen that diffusion happen on the ground. And I do think that if certain big labs are bought into this and start doing this, other companies will look and kind of adopt this as a framework. And there are civil society organizations, academics, et cetera, and folks who can also test this and publish papers and say, this is comprehensive, this is not comprehensive. So by directing attention to it and giving enough kind of guidance of this is what we think it should look like and this is what we think is effective and here's why, you get more eyes on the problem and people iterating and refining.
If you want to go deeper on AI governance, trust, and responsibility with me and other distinguished faculty of the world's top business school, sign up for the next cohort of Wharton's Strategies for Accountable AI online executive education program. featuring live interaction with faculty, expert interviews, and custom-designed asynchronous content. Join fellow business leaders to learn valuable skills you can put to work in your organization. Visit execed.wharton.upenn.edu/ACAI for full details. I hope to see you there. The obvious question with any private governance activities is whether there's a strong enough incentive without a government mandate, some enforcement possibility for noncompliance. So what makes you confident that there is enough if this is coming privately from organizations?
So there is incentive on the enterprise side to get this done. I know this from working with these companies, and they may, everyone on their earnings calls has said, AI this, AI that, this is the future. So they may not want to say publicly, like, we have a strategy, but we're not sure it's the right strategy. We're open to speaking to a lot of different startups. We're open to shifting. We need thought partners. And so the consultancies are coming in, like a McKinsey, and then you also have like an Accenture, and they're both helping with that strategy work and also partnering with startups and other kinds of organizations to make them aware of the products that are available. But there is a question of like, who are those who are on those teams? And I think there's an opportunity to just uplift all of these different entities. And so it's already happening on the enterprise side. On the startup side, these companies want to be successful and sell. The key here is codifying it in a contract. And so you could say all you want, like, yes, we should know. And there are like technical issues with some of this too. Like, can you actually know all of the data a model is trained on? But if you have a formal attestation of the company is saying XYZ, then lawyers are involved. And so you need a way to monitor what's happening on an ongoing basis. So this isn't just a one-time, you sign the deal, you're in, people are using your product. But what's happening on an ongoing basis, that's something else that comes up a lot in these procurement conversations, which is actually astonishing because these products change as new, research techniques come into play. So the products are changing, the data is changing, and you have a contract that's like for one point in time. So that doesn't work. So how do you create formal attestation so that you can then hold companies accountable? So this is all, it's happening, but it's still, as I mentioned, like things are moving so fast. I don't want to say it's an experiment because it's not quite at experiment level, but we have to see I think we should see how this plays out before some of this is made into a law. Or I know tons of states are proposing new laws, but this is my perspective and what I'm most excited about.
And you alluded to this before, but what role does the prospect of private legal liability play in all of this?
It's a challenging area, as you know. So as of right now, there's still a lot of question marks around liability, and laws have tried to push this in many different directions. And so we haven't seen, I like to look at like cyber attacks, cybersecurity, cyber insurance, things like that. And if there are any lessons we can draw from that world into now what we're seeing with AI assurance. And so I think there are just a lot of questions. Like, we haven't had a major incident. Cybersecurity, sure, and there are like some AI elements associated with that, but we haven't had even not necessarily the sci-fi situation, but something that was hugely damaging, and it raises all of these new questions around liability. So where we are is not quite that people are walking on eggshells. They're like, okay, we'll try this, we'll do this, the contract says this, and we'll kind of just see what happens. So I'm waiting for that. We'll see if a major incident arises and kind of what happens there. But people are buying insurance to account for these AI risks. It's not, if you look at the different policies, it's really not that comprehensive. Some have uncapped, but that's basically just like a Hail Mary. Like, we hope nothing happens. So companies really aren't covered. So I'm hoping that by developing these new kinds of contracts and having these considerations, we're starting to put some stakes in the ground around what that could look like moving forward.
Right. Contract is obviously one way to deal with liability to the extent that you're able to contract around things and courts are willing to honor that. Insurance markets, in theory, are the efficient solution because then you've got a private actor that has its own financial incentives to work on the customers and so forth. What do you think it will take to help those insurance markets mature in this area?
Yeah, I'm curious what your thoughts too are on any parallels to cyber insurance, because I do remember, I mean, I was most engaged with this space years ago at this point, but pricing those plans was incredibly challenging. You had entities, a lot of like public entities, whether it's hospitals or utilities and things like that, were experiencing cyber attacks and trying to buy insurance from these municipalities, and it was very challenging for them to have plans developed. It's not just like the big Fortune 100 companies of the world; it is like municipalities who are being affected, and so there's a pricing issue and like what is included in these plans. I think right now I've seen plans that really cover kind of the copyright training piece of like content provenance. And so it seems that insurers can kind of get their heads around this. Like we can guarantee through insurance and we can work out the liability and what the payment would look like around content provenance. But beyond that, I haven't seen much.
I haven't either. And
And,
that's why I'm curious, because presumably that would be a good outcome. But the question is, what can be done to hasten it?
well, the other piece here is the measurement piece and benchmarks. And so I work with ArcPrize, which is an AI benchmarking organization. And in order to develop insurance policy, you need to actually know what's going on with the technology and set thresholds. And I think that's something that the EU AI Act is trying to kind of like make reality through developing the code of practice. And I speak with those folks, and there are a lot of challenges around that, given that the benchmarks are in flux, the evals are in flux, who does the evaluations, who does the auditing, and things like that. And so we need to have a stronger measurement ecosystem so that you have precision to be able to build these kinds of policies in this insurance market.
What kinds of things can governments do more effectively to promote these kinds of market-based approaches? You mentioned the EU-AI Act. That's obviously a more heavyweight government set of mandates that's then pushing that code of practice. But are there ways to get to these kinds of results without that kind of prescriptive regulation?
I think that having a safe space for knowledge sharing is key. So I did this work through the Data and Trust Alliance, which is a Fortune 100 industry consortium made up of a lot of different executives at various companies. And so if there's any way for government to support more of these, if not just, industry groups, but really public-private partnerships. So when I think about the measurement side of things and talking about these risks, whether it's something that's an egregious risk, like a catastrophic risk, or something that's a little bit more kind of like less egregious, I guess I would say, like what role can the government play in supporting that ecosystem and bringing some rigor to it? And when I think about USG and the unique kind of like differentiated knowledge base, I don't work in the government. I've always worked in the public sector. But when we think about bioweapon risk, chemical risk, things like this, like the government knows the most about that from everyone. I mean, they have the labs. And so is there a way in terms of prioritization for the government to say, like, look at what they do best, where they have differentiated knowledge, and then partner with these outside experts to kind of up level some of that and also help grow the ecosystem and all of these key considerations, whether it's measurement, evals, and benchmarking, or let's say like what's happening in the insurance market that's a little bit further afield, but like what can the government do today to both codify, standardize, bring more rigor to this world, and then also help like accelerate it.
Are there areas where you think we do need governments to adapt AI specific rules?
So there are a lot of laws on the books that already deal with AI. What I think is really interesting is public sector procurement. And so I was looking at this a lot during the Biden administration as I started this procurement work with the Data and Trust Alliance. So what I believe ends up happening is that the government sets standards for AI procurement, and private sector will look at these and say, they're like, all right, we have this checklist, like we're not sure this is comprehensive and this is working, let's see what the government's
Mhm.
doing. Like they buy a lot of
Yeah.
stuff, and so they look at this and then adopt some of those principles into their own procurement work. And then on the lab side, what happens is, if a company, think of like, this is just an example, but like a Microsoft sells essentially to everyone. And so they're selling to the government, and they use these procurement criteria to build out their go-to-market strategy, build out their sales strategy. And if it ends up working, they might say, oh, let's take some of
Mhm.
that and pull it into our private sector practice, and take some of those. So I see public sector procurement, whatever those guidelines are that are developed, and now we have the action plan out of the Trump administration. So we'll see what comes out of that. And I know folks that are working on it. I see what Biden had put forward, and it was like fairly comprehensive, but there was still a lot that needed to be worked out. But I'm really looking to that as something that will likely set
Mhm.
standards and set industry practice outside of just the government.
How can companies deal with the variety of different rules that are out there, especially globally? If you've got a Fortune 100 company, they're going to be operating in Europe, they're going to be operating in the US, Asia, places which right now there doesn't seem to be a lot of prospects of complete alignment in terms of AI policy.
It is very complicated. I don't, it's why when, I mean, that I worked on this AI bill in California over the summer, SB 1047, and something that we spoke about a lot was what would happen. I mean, in this instance, California would have led, and like that may have been adopted by a lot of different states, and it would have had outsized impact because it wasn't just companies based in California, it was
Mhm.
operating in California. But when you have a patchwork of state legislation that you have to comply with, what does that look
Mhm.
like? When I was at Meta, we had CCPA where it was just
Mhm.
California, and we would have different rules for California and some other states, but it wasn't that we had to go state by state and change our strategy for every state. And then you look at it globally and what's happening with the EU. We had GDPR, CCPA. Like those were the kind of the big ones that we had to adhere to at the time. This was years ago. But if you have completely different rules, it is quite challenging. And then also with the EU and the code of practice that they're building there, I mean, this really is for frontier
Right.
models, so the biggest models, but how do you have to evaluate them a certain way. You have to report out certain information. You need to have auditors. So it's not just you as a company having to report out information. You have to engage like all of these different parties to do this. And so it's worth, I mean, I'm sure someone somewhere is building like a map of like how you actually operationalize this. But what I've seen coming from, I'm someone who builds products and ships products. I've worked with a lot of people at think tanks who put forward these ideas of regulation should look like this and look like this. And sometimes they don't quite think through like, how do you actually operationalize this? And that to me is always like the key challenge and what I go to first. So short answer, I don't know. It's really hard.
And just, you talked about SB 1047. Just say a little bit. You were really on the opposition side to that bill, which eventually was vetoed by the governor. What was so problematic from your perspective about it?
So let me just tell you how I got involved in this bill. So I had been working on these AI governance projects, and yes, governance was a big part of my work when I worked at tech companies. But I thought, okay, if I'm saying I do AI governance, I should know how bills or AI bills are being created and passed on the ground. And so I started tracking SB 1047 just as a bill that sounded interesting back in January, February. And then that turned out to be the bill that got a lot of traction. And there was like a lot of attention, which I think rightfully so. But I guess that's how politics goes. You kind of tie yourself to one thing, and like sometimes it blows up and sometimes it just fizzles away. And so I I started writing about this bill. A lot of chatter was happening online, whether it was on X or blogs or podcasts. And I just thought, how can anyone even make sense? I was obsessed. So I was like, okay, I'm going to pull all this together and start writing some articles just to help educate people about what's coming and what the potential implications are here. And so that bill changed a lot from when it was created to when it was ultimately vetoed. And it was over a short period of time. But where it ended up in a very different place from where it started. Where it started was to have a new entity or a subsection of an entity within the government, the state of California. They would have models submit information. They would be able to say this is a good model and a bad model, and there would be also an eval component of it where you would have auditors that would be evaluating the different AI labs. And so it's not helpful to like dissect the details of what the bill started out as versus where it ended. But for me, creating these kind of like net new organizations that would have oversight over companies and would codify it in law. There was also issues with downstream liability. So the developers would be liable if the model was used for something that was against what the law had laid out. So these kinds of issues kept bubbling up as something that would set precedent, and that would change the ecosystem. There was talk of, it would hinder open source development, it would make developers liable. So this like centralization element, this centralized oversight, and empowering this new group, for all of these reasons, I thought it was premature.
Yeah, I mean, one positive, at least from that experience, is, as you said, there was a huge amount of debate from both sides and back and forth. And, as with anything, some of it was not very well thought out. But I think in a lot of cases, there was really deep engagement, both at a technical level and a policy level on that bill, even though ultimately it was vetoed. So the last thing I want to ask you is just, going forward, are you optimistic that we will be able to have productive conversations on, both how to define this market-based AI governance and how to find the right intersection between what the government does and what companies do?
Yeah, so I think after SB 1047 was vetoed, Newsom pulled together this group of individuals who would be looking at what AI governance should be for the future of the state of California. And that report just came out. And I was very heartened by it because I thought he assembled a group, like you could tell quite thoughtfully, people who had a diverse range of views, but were incredibly technically sophisticated and could have a productive conversation. And so the recommendations that came out of that, I support many of them. I will write something with some, more ideas, but I think that's a great example of taking someone, and who knew if Newsom like delegated this to, like, I doubt that he knew all of these people personally at the time, but whoever was in charge of kind of bringing this group together did it exactly right. And you can't have, it's not that one voice kind of overshadows, or one point of view overshadows everyone else, but how do we work together to figure out what the future looks like? And so there are a few things. This private AI governance work, I'm hopeful seeing what organizations like the Data and Trust Alliance are doing. I think it requires being able to work with a lot of different kind of stakeholders, and then also really thinking about, and this is like the tech person in me, but like, what is the go-to-market here? Like, we don't need more frameworks. How do we actually fuel adoption and make this palatable and useful for all of these different kinds of groups? So that's one piece. I'm also really interested on the policy side, like seeing what happened with SB 1047 and the chatter that was happening online. It was challenging for me as someone who is just personally obsessed and engaged to kind of understand all of these moving parts and all of the commentary that was happening, and then the bill would change. And so is there any way to support the end-to-end policymaking process by actually leveraging AI tools, so we don't get into a situation where a bill is made public? And this happened kind of with SB 1047, where tech people are like doing their jobs in SF or in California and elsewhere. I mean, it got international attention. They're like, wait a second, what was proposed? Like, what is getting traction? And so is there any way to actually use AI to make this clearer, both to legislators, policymakers, staffers, of like what the interests of the community are and how they actually feel about things, so that it's less of a massive surprise and we can kind of bring people along. So that's what I'm really excited about. And I'm working with RAND, Tony Blair Institute, and Stimson Center on that.
Great. Lauren, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This has been The Road to Accountable AI. If you like what you're hearing, please give us a good review and check out my Substack for more insights on AI accountability. Thank you for listening.